Thank you very much. I think this is probably a phantasmagoria. This is the perfect setting, except it should be the 31st of October, maybe. I just want to start by thanking Stephen Jacobs and his colleagues for inviting me to give this lecture. This is my first visit to Ghent, and it's been a real pleasure, and I'm really delighted to be here. So this evening, this lecture is about paintings that come to life, people that turn to stone. It's about magic and illusion and the late Victorian visual imagination. It's about the willingness and pleasure of being seduced by the moving image. And therefore, I think this really is the perfect setting for this lecture. This is a still from Georges Méliès's The Enchanted Portrait of 1899. And the first section of this lecture is called Hauntings. The dream of motion haunts the visual arts from the classical period to the present day. Myths of enchanted images and moving statues can be traced through the history of Western art. Galatea steps down from her pedestal. Portrait figures break free of their frames. The gallery is haunted by the possibilities of life and imminent movement. Moving statues and haunted portraits convey a sense of the art object as the trace of a once living body that has been stilled and transformed, turned to stone or bronze, caught between layers of canvas and pigment. Life is suspended rather than terminated by these representations. The aging and decay of the body in everyday life is deferred until the life that is arrested within the image can be reanimated by some magical power. Until such time, the painted or stone body transcends physical change and lived experience. It becomes detached from the space and time of the observer and is turned instead into an unresisting object of desire and fascination. Stillness, the absence of movement and change, provides the ground for the creation of an aesthetic and erotic ideal, in which the body is forever the same and always available to the unwavering gaze of the viewer. But there's always more, for the haunted image hovers on the brink of life, seems to be not simply petrified, but rather hesitating before breaking into movement, breathing, seeing, and responding to the viewer's attentions and fantasies. It's this promise of animation that haunts the visual image. The transition from an inanimate to an animate state, the first sign of movement, or this first moment of movement, is thus a process of immense cultural and psychological potency. The figure comes back to life. It is the moment when the spatial and temporal separation of the viewer from the image breaks down, and the secret life of the image is revealed once more. The animated figure never fully casts off its previous deathly existence, however. There remain traces of its former petrified state and doubts concerning its hold on life. The transformation might be reversed, and the living portrait or statue stilled once more. So there's this fear in the image that comes to life that it could become still again. The animated figure thus troubles the boundaries between life and death, nature and representation, movement and stasis, sensibility and lack of feeling. Its apparent ability to move between these states is the source of its uncanny and disturbing power over the viewer. So living pictures and moving statues disturb the boundaries between imagination and reality. They reintroduce the fears and fantasies of the past into the present and the time of the beholder. The frame and the pedestal are the key elements within this configuration, marking the boundaries between the living and the dead, and the conceptual possibilities of animation. Confined within its frame, or anchored to its pedestal, the art object remains inert, lifeless. The moment the object is brought to life, it breaks free of the world of representation and enters the reality of the viewer. This is also a narrative of intense desire, in which the viewer is omnipotent, and the power and intensity of the gaze becomes the instrument for generating life. But the space of the haunted gallery also marks the suspension of these higher, more elevated discourses, and in the hands of late 19th century magicians, filmmakers, and advertisers, it became a place of artifice and parodic comedy, in which spirits might appear in the shape of a whiskey bottle rather than as the return of the repressed. This is an engraving of the scene from Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Rottigore, which was printed in the graphic in 1887. And you can see it's all those empty frames are the ancestral portraits, and the figures that are walking around are the figures from the ancestral portraits that have come to life. The golden age of the haunted gallery, of fantasies of animated paintings and moving statues, lasts from the beginning of the 18th century for nearly 200 years, reaching a peak at the end of the 19th century and in the early years of the 20th century. This cultural history coincides in Britain with the history of industrial modernisation, and in many ways the haunted gallery provides a subversive counterspace to that of the factory. The gallery's meaning and potency lies in its age and the traces of the past that are suspended within its walls. It's an aristocratic, ancestral space, open only to the few who have access to its high cultural forms and fantasies. There is no labour in the haunted gallery, and its only products are those of the imagination. Visitors communicate with the spirits of past culture and indulge in ancestor worship. It is a place of ambiguous sights and visions, as opposed to the assault of mechanical sound in the industrial factory. The haunted gallery is essentially the setting for optical illusions and special effects. It's where people go who wish to suspend their disbelief and to revel in the exquisite terrors of animation. The histories of industrialisation and of the haunted gallery converge in the 18th century novel. The public for the haunted gallery was increased immeasurably by the printing revolution and the emergence of the novel in the first half of the 18th century. Haunted portraits and moving statues were now accessible to a literate, fiction-reading public who could experience the sensations of the gallery vicariously through the printed pages of a Gothic novel. One of the first and best-known examples of a walking portrait in the literature of this period is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. Set in an old castle, the novel teems with medieval motifs and supernatural manifestations. In one scene, the villain, Manfred, forces himself on the Princess Isabella. At that moment, the portrait of his grandfather, which hangs in the room where they're sitting, comes to life and utters a deep sigh. And now I'm just going to quote a little passage from the novel. Manfred, distracted between the flight of Isabella, who had now reached the stairs, and his inability to keep his eyes from the picture, which began to move, had, however, advanced some steps after her, still looking backwards on the portrait, when he saw it quit its panel and descend on the floor with a grave and melancholy air. "Do I dream?" cried Manfred, returning, "or are the devils themselves in league against me?" Ere he could finish the sentence, the vision sighed again and made a sign to Manfred to follow him. This scene, with the walking picture as a form of ancestral hubris for an errant living relative, was illustrated, dramatised, quoted, and reworked well into the 20th century. The intense pleasure and thrill of magical images were highly sought by both elite and middle-class audiences in the second half of the 18th century, where readers could simulate the experience through the novel and its various cultural spin-offs. European travellers and connoisseurs arranged to visit Italian art galleries at night, when the special effects created by torchlight produced the illusion in a willing audience that the statues and paintings had come to life. By the last decades of the 18th century, audiences were seeking hallucinatory and sensational effects from literature, theatre, and the visual arts, and magical images were an effective source for these intense and moving cultural experiences. The development of the haunted gallery as a space for cultural fantasy and the history of machines for creating optical illusions continuously weave in and out of each other during the 18th and 19th centuries. As far as the spectral effects of animated paintings and statues were concerned, projected images created particularly compelling and terrifying effects that blended magic and science, the sacred and the secular, enchantment and technology. This is a magic lantern from around the 1860s in the Bill Douglas Centre in the University of Exeter. The separation of the projected image from its point of production, its luminosity, scale, transparency, and mutability made it the perfect medium for the creation of apparently supernatural effects. This was the art of the magic lantern, an instrument dating back at least to the 17th century. The magic lantern was an adaptable and an effective form of modern entertainment. It was portable and could be easily transported by individual showmen and set up in a range of different venues, from small country fairs to large urban theatres. This is a beautiful image of a ceramic decorated plate with a figure of a travelling lanternist on it. Showmen at the end of the 18th century created extravagant theatrical performances in which supernatural forms were projected onto a range of surfaces by machines hidden from the view of the audience. This is a print, I'm sorry, I'm not sure, I think it looks a little bit blurred to me from here, of a phantasmagoria by E.G. Robertson. These phantasmagoria reached their height of popular success in the performances created by Etienne Gaspard Robertson, who took his particular version of the ghostly spectacle around European capitals at the end of the 18th century, finding a permanent home in a ruined convent in Paris, which he transformed into a theatre of the macabre. His nightmarish performances, with their animated, shimmering spectral forms, terrified and delighted the viewing public. The visual effects of the slides were enhanced by smoke, lighting, glass, and mirrors, creating a total environment devoted to the representation and experience of haunting. From here, it is merely the slightest move to the projected images of film and the haunted gallery of cinema. And what interests me in particular about this poster advertising Edison's Vitascope is, of course, the way that the image is embedded in a gilded frame, as if it's a picture that within which the images are moving. The theme of the animated painting or sculpture took on a renewed significance at the end of the 19th century with the development of new forms of photographic technology for the creation of lifelike, moving images. And this, of course, is a well-known poster advertising the Lumiere cinematograph. The programme for the first public film show staged by the Lumiere brothers at the Grand Café in Paris in December 1895 announced, and I quote, "For only 1 franc, you'll see life-size figures move and come to life before your very eyes." This was the Gothic nightmare in celluloid form, a photographic enactment of the living portrait. Some of the first film shows began with a still frame that the projectionist then cranked into life. Life-size figures walked from the distance towards the audience, like an ancestral portrait stepping out of its frame and laying its hand on the shoulders of the living. Is it surprising that early filmmakers turned so frequently to the subject of the animated painting, to the image or statue that is magically endowed with a mischievous life? The theme, I would suggest, was a metaphor for the new medium and its representational powers. Film surpassed the illusionistic capacities of the traditional arts. It could endow inanimate forms with life, but they were only shadows and illusions of absent originals. The monochrome of early film and the absence of synchronized sound were constant reminders of the deceptive nature of film and the inevitable, dreaded failure of its claims to capture life. The search for the spirit or life within the inert art object was evident across all forms of visual media at the end of the 19th century. The exquisite passage from stasis to movement, the hesitation and moment of delay prior to motion, became the fool's gold of representational practices in the period. But in an age when lovelorn sculptors could no longer pray to benign goddesses to animate their creations, the power to endow the image with life was handed over to magicians, lanternists, filmmakers, and artists. Okay, section 2 is called Pygmalionism and the Image. This is a British painting by an artist called Ernest Normand, and it's called Pygmalion and Galatea, 1886. The prototype of the 19th century narrative of life-giving erotic rapture can be found in Ovid's story of the sculptor Pygmalion and his obsessive love for his ivory statue. So the story, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I'll summarise it for you. Pygmalion carves an astonishingly realistic statue of a beautiful woman from the purest ivory. From Ovid's first description of the figure, it is evident that it bears within itself a secret, suspended life, and I quote, "It had the face of a real maiden, who, you would have thought, was living, and, if self-respect were not stopping her, wanted to move." Now, I think these are some of the most significant lines of Ovid's text, suggesting that the subsequent transformation of the stone statue into living flesh isn't simply a divine creation of life, but a realization and an animation of something that's already present and immanent in the work of art. So, Pygmalion falls in love with the beautiful statue. He caresses it and begins to imagine that the figure's form is soft and responsive, that it returns his kisses. The sculptor woos his creation. He brings it gifts of jewellery, dresses it, and finally lays it on his bed. It's in this state of intense erotic delusion that he attends the festival of Venus, where he prays to the goddess. Venus responds to his appeal, and when Pygmalion returns to the statue and resumes his lovemaking, the figure begins to change its nature. It grows warm and soft. It yields to his touch like warm wax. The carver of stone moulds and palpates the metamorphosing figure and is convinced of her reality when he sees the blood flowing through her body and infusing it with colour. She blushes at his kisses. She opens her eyes and gazes at her lover creator. Through the intervention of the goddess, the figure becomes not simply a moving statue, but a woman. She feels embarrassment, manifests signs of modesty, and responds with desire to the life-giving desire of Pygmalion. Well, such was the cultural resonance of this narrative of the power of male sexual desire that it was able to make the move in the late 19th century from reworkings of classical mythology and erotic writing to the developing science of sexology and its classification of erotic mania and sexual perversion. For Benjamin Tarnowski, the desire for and adoration of pictures and statues was symptomatic of those suffering from particularly pronounced forms of erotic delirium. Tarnowski identified ancient Greece as being especially rich in cases of erotomaniacs attempting sexual congress with a statue. In particular, he referred to the story of Chrysippus, who became infatuated with a marble statue in the temple of Samos. When his attempt to make love to the statue failed as a result of the coldness of the stone, he apparently placed a slab of raw meat over the genital area of the figure, and in this way was able to satisfy his desire. If the story of Chrysippus reduced the piety and sexual longing of Pygmalion to the humiliating image of sex with a piece of meat, then such crude realizations of the ancient myth were also to be found in recent cases. Tarnowski cited the example from France in 1877 of a gardener who fell in love with a statue representing Venus de Milo in a park. Even more recently in St. Petersburg, a man had been arrested for paying nightly visits to the statue of a nymph located on a terrace in a private country estate. The profusion of anecdotes from classical antiquity to the early 20th century of sexual encounters with statues is predicated on the exquisite balancing act between the absolute stillness and unresponsiveness of the stone nude and the fantasy of animation, of the unblemished perfection of the figure aroused by the will and desire of the male viewer or lover. It's hard to say at times in these accounts which state appears more desirable, hard motionlessness or yielding corporeality. The optimum condition, therefore, is that of becoming, of transforming, metamorphosing, when the figure possesses the properties of both marble and flesh. For Ovid's Pygmalion, this would be the moment when he returns to his statue after praying to Venus, resumes his lovemaking, and notices the physical changes in his creation. Ecstasy for Pygmalion must surely be experienced at the moment he recognizes the differences between his earlier illusions of metamorphosis and their present reality and fulfillment. So, the particular challenge of this subject for painters was how to capture the erotic charge of this process and render it visible in a single image. So the artist has to kind of take this duration of metamorphosis and render it visible in a still single image. One obvious solution to this artistic problem could be found in Ovid's reference to the statue's initial blush and Pygmalion's realization that blood was circulating through the figure. Colour, then, was the medium for the visual depiction of the state of becoming animated. In nearly every case of paintings from this period, however, it's the lingering signs of the figure's lapidary and its stone, inanimate existence that most forcefully signify the imminent realization of emotional, sexual life. So what I'm arguing is that although we get these signs of colour and life and warmth, it's actually the combination of signs of stoniness, with that body look that is the powerful combination. Without these, the living statue was simply in nude. And this is one example where you see the bottom of the statue is still stone. It still looks like marble, whereas the face begins to have carnations on the cheeks and begins to resemble flesh. In Jean-Léon Réaume's version of Pygmalion and Galatea around 1890, the liminal state of the figure is conveyed by the contrast between the upper and lower parts of the body. From the waist upwards, the form takes on the creases and pink carnation of living flesh. Below the arm of the sculptor, it remains a pale ivory, with the feet apparently less modelled and still part of the stone plinth. As in other depictions of the subject, it appears as though the sculptor was still working on the figure when the goddess intervened. The wooden hammer lies abandoned on the floor, and the statue stands on a raised wooden platform, allowing the artist to work on all the surfaces of the freestanding figure. The metamorphosing figure thus leans down to embrace Pygmalion, but awkwardly, as though the stony condition of her lower body prevents completely lifelike movement. She is caught between the states of posed sculpture and natural living body. Moreover, in common with 19th century reworkings of Ovid's tale, in which the animated figure returns to stone, there is a disturbing ambiguity in the image. Is the statue in the process of becoming human, or is this a real woman who is being turned to stone? There's really no way of deciding that. Is Pygmalion's embrace one of greeting or of valediction? In many ways, the image is a tour de force. Gérôme's ostentatious display of his technical abilities and his skill at painting the female nude. It is a demonstration of painting's power of illusion, displayed in the artist's name, carved on the marble pedestal. So it's just on, it's actually, it's just where that cursor was on the right of the pedestal. Flesh and stone succumb to the artist's magic, but true metamorphosis and the dream of animation remained an aesthetic chimera. In the last decades of the 19th century, artists and sculptors turned repeatedly to the subject of Pygmalion and his animated statue, as though drawn by its explicit and unavoidable evocation of the enduring aesthetic problem of how the still image or object might represent the beginnings of life and movement. Subjects derived from Ovid's narrative, however, presented a different challenge from that of realism or verisimilitude in general. They required that the artist made visible incipient life and the commencement of motion, the simultaneous presence within the single female figure of inert matter and living flesh. In England, Edward Burne-Jones adopted a different solution to the question of how to depict the temporality of this metamorphosis from statue to woman. There are 4 paintings in his series Pygmalion and the Image, painted between 1868 and 1878. The project was originally developed as a set of illustrations to William Morris's reworking of Ovid in The Earthly Paradise. In the first picture of the series, which is this one, The Heart Desires, Pygmalion is represented deep in thought before an unfinished marble group of the 3 Graces. Excuse me. Set within its original gilt frame, the canvas may be seen as a meditation on pictorial containment and the power of aesthetic desire. The second picture is subtitled The Hand Refrains. In this scene, Pygmalion has sculpted a new marble figure. Importantly, the scale of the statue has changed and is now life-size, a viable fantasy lover for the longing sculptor. The plinth on which the figure stands is a roughly hewn rock surrounded by loose chippings. This reminder of the stony origins of the figure is significant because it is already showing the signs of corporeality, such as the fleshy tones on the legs and torso, and the disposition of fingers and toes. In the eyes of Pygmalion, and doubtless those of the sexual fantasists defined by Havelock Ellis, the statue in this second painting is the perfect love object, a stone woman on the brink of animated desire. The third painting depicts the goddess's intercession and the moment that the statue is brought to life and held down from the marble plinth. Neither female figure displays any significant degree of animation, however. Both have expressionless, glazed eyes, and their physical contact is concentrated in the elegant knot of arms and hands at the centre of the canvas. In the final picture, The Soul Attains, Pygmalion is united with his living statue. Curiously, though, life seems to have drained from the figure entirely, which now appears more statue-like and impassive than in the previous painting. Desire for Burne-Jones's Pygmalion is precarious, destined to remain fixated on the figure in a liminal state between stone and flesh. It's historically consistent that the story of Pygmalion enjoyed a renewed popularity in the visual arts in the late 19th century, just when attempts to design machines to create living pictures and moving images were escalating and had assumed a pressing momentum. The shift from inert matter to living, breathing flesh, which was embodied in Pygmalion's story, must have seemed especially compelling to image makers who were testing the limits of existing visual media and seeking new ways of representing life and movement. This fascination with the shifts between inanimate and animate states can be traced across a range of popular and high art forms in the period. This is an illustration from a book showing you how to make your own photographic statuette portrait. Not only did statues and pictures come to life, but the living seemed constantly on the brink of turning to stone and transforming into a frozen image. In the late 1890s, the statuette portrait became a fashionable photographic amusement that involved turning the subject into a marble bust. This desire to turn oneself to stone must be understood in relation to the cluster of narratives of metamorphosis and animation in this period. If art could claim the power to create life, then it could also obliterate the body and turn living flesh to stone. Trick photography allowed its subjects to become their own living statues and to freeze mortality through the illusions created by carefully doctored negatives. Part 3, Tableau Vivant. This is a poster advertising Tableau Vivant entertainments. And you can see here at the bottom different arrangements of living figures. So there is a continuous interplay in the 19th century between the fantasy of the inanimate object that comes to life and the dream of the living body that turns to stone. This cultural oscillation between states of animation and petrification, of movement and stillness, is clearly displayed in the tableau vivant. Now, a tableau vivant was simply a performance in which live models reproduced a well-known painting or sculpture and held the pose for a set period of time. The resulting picture was thus living, but devoid of movement. As the genre developed, the arrangements became increasingly elaborate, using props, costumes, lighting, and specially designed theatrical machinery to make the resulting tableau as much like the original as possible. This style of performance became popular under a number of different names, such as tableau vivant, living statuary, and living pictures. This is a photograph of one of these performers in a Venus de Milo figure. These popular Victorian performances used living, breathing bodies to create icons of inert stillness that might suddenly break into movement. Performers, clothed in white body stockings to simulate the purest marble, suspended their bodies in the silent poses and gestures of high art. They momentarily trapped movement within the contours of a pose, and then gradually dissolved back into soft, smooth motion. Statues started into life, and living bodies became hard stone. Tableau vivant created a magical haunted gallery that played across the boundaries between art and life. The picture that comes to life was a theme that by the end of the 19th century was both thoroughly familiar and still capable of producing arresting and disturbing effects. The cultural resonance of the haunted gallery was harnessed to commercial interests in one of the most adventurous advertising campaigns of the period. This is a picture from 1894, the whiskey of his forefathers. I hope you can see it's a young laird drinking of scotch, and it's so delicious that his ancestors are coming into their portraits. In 1894, Dewars, the Scotch whisky company, commissioned Matthew B. Howardine to make a painting that would provide the basis for a major international advertising campaign. The painting, The Whiskey of His Forefathers, shows a young laird drinking whiskey in his ancestral home, while his forefathers climb out of their portraits in their longing to try the drink. The image works because of the familiarity of the haunted picture theme. The ruddy-faced, corporeal spirits lean across the gilt frames of their portraits and reach out for the bottle of whiskey. In the top left corner, a pair of tartan-clad legs suggests that a second tier of ghostly figures is making its way down to the bottle. Up to this point, the campaign remains firmly within the conventions of fine art-inspired Victorian advertising. With the appearance of film, however, an advert like this was no longer innovative, and Dewars went on to use the concept for one of the earliest film advertisements. And this is a still from that film, Jeweler's Whiskey of His Forefathers, 1900. There are two versions of the advertising film, the first made by Edison in 1898, and a later version made by the British Mutoscope and Biograph Company in 1900. Moreover, the projected image was big, and Edison's version was projected onto the side of the Pepper Building in New York's Times Square. Film, advertising, and ghostly animated paintings come together in perfect synergy in the service of late Victorian commodification. The enduring fascination of the trope of the haunted picture gallery lies in part in its mutability and adaptation to new forms of visual media. It's still doing this. Successive technologies demonstrated their magical properties through their power to animate the dead image. To this extent, it's an ongoing history, as the digital effects of haunted portraits in recent films of Harry Potter or Disney's The Haunted Mansion demonstrate. Okay, my next section is the enchanted painting. The number of early films that take as their subject the enchanted painting is very striking indeed. Makers of trick or transformation films in the late 1890s and early 1900s used all the available techniques of film illusion, such as stop-motion effects, multiple exposure and dissolves, to create spectacular visions of pictures that come to life and figures that metamorphose, appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. More often than not in these films, the animated figure is a source of pandemonium, who wrecks the world of the bemused artist and ridicules his attempts at artistic creativity. In the end, the demonic magician is usually triumphant, and the artist is abandoned to his unrequited desire and inadequate creative powers. Artists in these films are a pretty sorry bunch. Either sleeping or in a state of waking amazement, they are rarely at work and are always outdone by the film's magic effects or the demonic personification. It can often seem in enchanted painting films that their central purpose is to undermine the long-established mythology of artistic creativity. Trick effects are used to flaunt the ease with which films can simulate the making and unmaking of art and impart life to the lifeless image. In the face of this technical ease, the artists in these films are often left in a state of helpless rage or resigned sleep. What I'm going to do now is show you, it's about a 2-minute film made by Edison in 1901 called The Artist's Dilemma, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you'll see some of the points that I've just made. Okay, so there's the artist in his studio. He poses the magical model, so posing flowers, and goes to his canvas. But out comes this weird clown. He starts wooing the model. Artist tells him to get lost. And the clown sort of says, look, I can do that. Forget all this easel stuff. Get my pot of gold. This is a reverse motion. That's the way this is the motion. Poor artist. the artist is on his own again. No picture, no masterpiece. Goes to sleep. The context for that kind of film would be that it would be part of a bigger program of short films like that, and would have had a kind of musical sound accompaniment. It wouldn't have been silent. Film played with the time of painting. If masterpieces took a long time to create, then magic films could make them in an instant. And when the painting was finally complete, film transformed the still image into a living human being. Thomas Edison's 1901 film is a fascinating summation of these themes. The film begins with the familiar scene of the artist asleep in his studio. As he sleeps, the door of a carved grandfather clock opens and out steps a female figure in a theatrical dancer's costume. She wakes the artist, who takes her to a raised platform and indicates that he wishes to paint a portrait. Placing her in a very conventional pose, reclining against a pedestal and holding a bouquet of flowers, he takes up his palette, brushes and mildstick. As he begins work on his canvas, another figure emerges from the clock. Half clown, half demon, this mysterious figure is the genius technology of spirit of film, who will unravel all the artist's attempts to paint a likeness of the model. The clown shows his admiration for the model and begins to disrupt the artist's work, suggesting that he can do better. Rejecting the painter's palette and brushes, he reaches into the clock and grabs a large bucket of paint and a huge paintbrush. With a few strokes, he covers the canvas, and to the distress and amazement of the artist, a perfect likeness of the model is produced. The demon clown then goes over to the canvas, holds out his own hand, and the image comes to life and steps out of the picture. She's joined by the model, and together they dance a can-can before kicking the artist and the demon to the floor. The men pick themselves up, the two women merge into one, and the demon disappears into the remaining female figure. The artist, delighted to be left with his beautiful model, embraces her, and she turns back into the demon. The demon strikes the artist, jumps into the air, and disappears. The artist is left alone again with his blank canvas. This exhilarating film is like a short discourse on the nature of visual representation in the age of film. As American film historian Marianne Doan has argued, it's significant for this reading that both the model and the demon emerge from the clock, introducing the theme of time and representation that runs through the piece. Through the figure of the demon, film usurps all the illusionistic functions of art. It can make and unmake painting in a moment, and it can animate the lifeless image. The artist is the dope, turned upon by both his model and his living image. There can be no doting Galatea in this world, just the agonizing blankness of the empty canvas. When pictures come to life, they don't become part of the ordinary, everyday world, but enter a kind of dream time haunted by visions and mischief makers. This is the space created by magic films, with their relentless mockery of still images and traditional media. In order to demonstrate its own mastery, however, film had to keep returning to the still image, the basic component of its own modern life, and show its power to transform stasis into motion. In fact, the entire filmic trope of the enchanted painting must be seen as a founding myth of the new medium, and a potent visual expression of its own existence through the animation of still images to create living pictures. The importance of early film's visible display of its own means of image production and its simultaneous dependence on and transcendence of older forms of still media is demonstrated by a subgroup within the genre of animated painting films depicting the figure of the artist or just the artist's hand in the act of creating a picture. In nearly every case, trick effects are used to transform the nature and condition of the resulting image. For example, the process of drawing is accelerated by deliberately changing the speed at which the camera is cranked. Drawings are transformed into people by using stop-motion substitution. Or cartoon portraits become animated and interact with a series of drawn and real objects. The origins of this type of trick film can be traced in part to musical entertainment called lightning sketches, in which a cartoonist displayed their technical dexterity by rapidly executing a series of drawings and changing their subject matter with a few deft lines and alterations. But the trick films went far beyond the illusions of the lightning sketcher. They took off from where the musical performance necessarily concluded, giving the artist the magical power of animation. And this is a still from Edison's The Enchanted Drawing of 1900. In The Enchanted Drawing, a cartoonist, in fact a real artist conjurer called J. Stuart Blackton, is shown in front of a large blank sheet of paper on an easel. He rapidly sketches the comic portrait of a man. He then draws a bottle of wine and a glass. He reaches towards them, and as he removes them from the sheet of paper, they become real in his hands. He's holding a real bottle of wine and a glass. The artist pours himself a drink, and the expression on the watching cartoon face changes to a frown. When the artist pours another drink and offers it to the cartoon face, the face smiles happily. The rest of the short film continues with this play on reality and representation, as the cartoon face reacts to the additions of a hat and a cigar. This is much more than a filmic record of a vaudeville act, or a celebration of the art of the caricaturist. It is a display of film's ability to move between documentary and magic, between the real world and the world of images. Comedy cartoons, under the title, and this is what they were called, By the Hand of the Artist, were amongst the most successful trick films in Charles Urban's lists, and became an ongoing series in the early 1900s. Advertising his most recent addition to the series in 1904, the catalogue described the film as the most, quote, amazing and amusing magic film ever made. It continued, and this is how the catalogue described the film. Illusion follows illusion. Mystery succeeds mystery in this most attractive subject, until the spectators are lost in amazement and delight. The hand of the artist draws outline faces in chalk on a blackboard. The outlines fill and assume living form and muscular movement. They eat, drink, smoke, express pleasure and satisfaction without leaving the blackboard, after which the images are removed by an ordinary duster or mysteriously disappear feature by feature. The film offers a cornucopia of film illusions, above and beyond simple animated cartoons. A cut-out paper clown becomes a real figure and performs tricks in a circus ring drawn on a blackboard. Smoke issues from the drawn mouth of a Pierrot, and a seemingly endless length of tape is drawn from the mouth of a cartoon head. Urban's catalogues also advertised other trick films that offered variations on the enchanted drawing type. The Sorcerer's Scissors showed figures cut from paper and coming to life. Paper tearing depicted figures in costume made from torn paper create, in their turn, further figures from shreds, rolls, sheets and strips of paper. Whatever the medium used to create inanimate images, film demonstrated its capacity to bring life. So it's almost like every form still image is animated in these early films. Frequently, at the end of these sequences, there would be a knowing, comic gesture to the audience. A hand crumpling the paper from which the figures had been formed and turning it to confetti. An eye, the last remaining feature of an erased cartoon head, winking out at the audience from the screen. Who was the butt of this ongoing joke? Neither the audience nor the filmmakers, but the artists, whose medium was being conjured with and mocked through the trickery of film. Right, I'm just going to conclude now. This is an illustration from a book published in 1897 of Hampton Court. The Haunted Gallery at Hampton Court Palace was opened to the public in March 1918, in the last months of the First World War. The largest royal house in England, Hampton Court was founded by Cardinal Wolsey in 1515, and notoriously taken into possession by Henry VIII, who spent time there with his 6 wives. The Haunted Gallery belongs to this Tudor period. 160 feet in length, 15 feet in width, and punctuated by 6 large Gothic windows, it's said to be haunted by the ghost of Henry V's wife, Queen Catherine Howard. By 1918, it was an emblem of English history, picturesque and romantic. Opening the site to civilians and the armed forces was a gesture that symbolised the values of ancient monarchy and popular freedom for which Britain was fighting. And in a world in which the spirits of the dead were an almost palpable dimension of everyday experience, the Haunted Gallery held an especially powerful fascination for its visitors. A gallery is a space for pictures and for ghosts, for endless pacing watched by portraits of generations of the dead. It is a place of presences, but not life, of likenesses which seem real, but which are merely representations or figments of the imagination. An 1897 history of Hampton Court illustrated the Haunted Gallery. How apt that the shadows cast on the ceiling by the windows and tapestried walls look like a strip of film, with intermittent picture frames separated by short intervals of blank darkness. Set this sequence in motion, and the enchantment begins. The pictures come to life, and the ghosts haunt the gallery. The Haunted Gallery is a powerful metaphor for the uncanny magic of early film. Every still frame is haunted by the photographic likenesses of those who are no longer there. Each time the projector is set in motion, the figures step out of their frames and come to life. There is, however, an instant of hesitation and doubt. Does the image move? Can it live? But the moment cannot be held for long. Early film animates. It must create hauntings and emotion. Remember, for only one franc, see life-size figures come to life before your very eyes. Come to life, but not live. The Lumiere boast carries an acknowledgement of the nature and limits of the medium, of its ability to simulate life, but just to create ghosts. This is what Maxim Gorky experienced when he watched a Lumiere program in Russia in 1896. It's a very famous piece of writing. Looking at a film of a street scene in Paris, Gorky saw absence, not presence, lack of sound and lack of colour. A scene full of movement, but without life, that was terrifying to behold. Curses and ghosts, he wrote, the evil spirits that have cast entire cities into eternal sleep, come to mind, and you feel as though Merlin's vicious trick is being enacted before you. Gorky recognised the primitive within the modern, the magical antecedents of modern technology. Here was the experience of the Haunted Gallery stripped of its romanticism and pleasant familiarity, filled with the dark spectres of the symbolist imagination, the shadows of life, and not life itself. Thank you.
There's still time for some questions or maybe critical remarks. Opens the floor.
Perhaps I've enchanted you all.
There have recently been some sort of controversy around people who call themselves objectophiles, to get back to your Pygmalion, people who fall in love with inanimate objects, including statues but also buildings. But there's a woman who married the Eiffel Tower and stuff like that.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's actually true. And another one married the Berlin Wall. Well, what they claim that it's not an oddity or a sexual perversion or, as you said, erotic delirium, but it's a sexual orientation. So it's a normal part of human nature.
I was really using the language of the sexologists of Krafft Ebing and those writers at the end of the 19th century who specifically used the Pygmalion myth as a kind of erotomania delusion, and of course it has this great sort of classical heritage to it. I don't really mind if one wants to marry the Eiffel Tower, that's fine. But I wasn't passing a moral judgment or a normative judgment. It's kind of weird though, isn't it?
It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Maybe with lots of pieces of meat against it.
It's a horrible image, that actually, isn't it?
Like a whole thing.
Struck me in the era of the origins of film that so many paintings have been made of the Pygmalion story, which deals with sculpture.
Yes.
Whereas film, you said, animates everything, makes everything move.
Yes.
Why that fascination for the Pygmalion myth in painting in the 19th century? I remember from Stoica's book, it's in the 18th century where you have lots of statues on the Pygmalion motif.
But there's an incredible paradox of a statue of the Pygmalion myth, isn't there? Because that's doomed before it even starts. And I think that's what painters try to do, is capture that sort of the moment of imminence, the kind of the moment of transformation. And I think the three, well, actually, I don't like the Burne-Jones. I think Burne-Jones is getting very tied up with this kind of ideal feminine beauty that actually, when she steps out, she seems less real than almost when she's on the pedestal. But I think with the Gérôme and the Normand, they're really showing that they can sort of capture this moment of transformation. And the Gérôme is the most, it's a beautiful composition because she's so stiff from there, and then you see this kind of movement as she encircles her arm. So I think it's about the way these different mediums and creators are kind of quoting and transcending each other. And I think that's my argument for early film, is that they're sort of saying we can outdo anything that these other media have done before in terms of illusion, of this illusion of life.
I think also interesting maybe is that in the discourse on modernist art in the 19th century, especially in France with Baudelaire and de Goncourt and Théophile Gautier, is that especially painting is equated with life, flux, fragments, ephemeral appearances, whereas sculpture is identified with death and stasis. But was that discourse also present in the works among the painters you were talking about?
Not that I'm aware of, but the thing that's interesting, I've been teaching Baudelaire again this term, and I was the painter of modern life, the section on women, And it's amazing when he's talking about female beauty within modernity. He describes women as portraits. He talks about them as being on pedestals. So he freezes them as well. And I wasn't really aware of how often he uses that metaphor of women as in frames or portraits or pedestals. And I think it literally is they are statues, they're works of art, their makeup, their costume. Strangely enough, because I know we all think modernity is fleeting, transient, and so on, that actually he seems to want to freeze femininity into these works of art.
Are there any known cases of where the sex gender has switched, so where there's a woman who creates a man who's probably like before in the 19th?
I can't think of one. I honestly, there are some people here who've done research. I can't think of one, and I'm not surprised that I can't think of one, because it is so deeply invested in male omnipotence and creativity that it would have been so subversive.
And you think there is a kind of gender division in the early film? Like statues coming to life are usually female, whereas paintings coming to life are usually...
No. The in these kind of trick films, it's often women who come out, because then they play with the artist and sort of turn him into a fool, really. So it's often a pretty girl who comes out of the portrait, and the Mephisto figure is male too. Yeah. I can't think of one.
Everybody's wanted. Apparently.
I was thinking in contemporary visual culture there's a kind of, I don't know whether it's a similar dynamic, but there's at the moment where digital games that are being presented in visual arts, and there's vice versa relationship that resembles some of the dynamics that you have here.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's no accident that there's been such a resurgence of interest in these early years of film at the time of the emergence and proliferation of digital media. I think so many of the issues of illusion and immersion, the relationship of the spectator, not necessarily to film, but to stereoscopic photography, 3D, panoramas, all of these technologies seem to kind of prefigure the kind of technological creativity of digital media. And I mean, there are others, who have written about this. But, and I think that's why the special effects of Harry Potter go back to these tropes of, in Hogwarts or whatever it is, there's a whole staircase of portraits who talk to him, and then they have rows with each other. But the obviously the effects are incredible. So I think there is, and there are also some really interesting. There's an artist whose work I'm very interested in, called Matt Collishaw. I don't know if any of you know his work. He was a young British YBA, young British artist, and his work explores a lot of those pre-film optical technologies, zoetropes and phenakistoscopes, but with a kind of real subversion of Victorian sexual ideologies. So he works with moving images, photographs of Charcot's hysterics, but then he animates them, and he's really interesting, but using these older technologies in order to create very kind of contemporary meanings. Yeah.
In response to the Japanese question, it's not entirely the same, but in the discourse of modern sculptures, we do find some critique from male critics that it's we find it very hard to imagine that a woman actually modeled a male body or even a nude female body, that it was really unthinkable.
Oh, that's interesting.
Very touching.
Yeah.
The nude body.
Yeah. So that's from the same period, the late 90s. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. No, but it's still it's about creativity, isn't it? And also, I mean, depending on what sculptural technique you're using, it's moulding, isn't it? It's that, you know, palpating the kind of warm, something that can be sort of shaped and formed. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Iemand? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your question.